This is Jim Montague, Executive Editor of Control Magazine and ControlGlobal.com, and this is the latest in our Control Amplified podcast series. As usual, we're talking with different experts about important topics in the process control and automation field, and seeking to go beyond our print and online coverage to explore some of the underlying issues affecting users, system integrators, suppliers, and other people and organizations in these industries. Yet again, I'm interviewing our friends at ARC Advisory Group, who provided some level-headed input for my late-breaking news story on the early impacts of coronavirus disease 2019 on the process automation and control industries for the April 2020 issue of Control. They summarized some of the early responses to the pandemic and detailed how digital transformation may give users some flexibility and remote collaboration, monitoring and control tools they'll need to handle similar crises in the future. With me today is Larry O'Brien, ARC's Vice President for Research. His area of expertise is process automation on the supplier side and the upstream and midstream oil and gas industry. We're also joined by Craig Resnick, Vice President and a member of the automation consulting team at ARC that covers the PLC, PAC, HMI, OIT, and industrial PC markets, as well as the packaging, plastics, and rubber industries. Well, guys, thanks for your nimble response despite the unprecedented events we're all going through now, and let's get started.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Good, great to be here.
Okay. All right. Beyond all the mainstream coverage of COVID-19, how is the pandemic affecting the process automation and controls industries so far? What input are you guys getting?
Well, this is Craig. I would say we've been getting, it's probably been a little bit unbalanced in the respect of kind of what industries are seeing kind of like an immediate surge versus what industries seem to be slowing down. On some of the industries that are really kind of feeling the surge aspect, you think of it as you're going through a shift in models for people who are now having a lot of products that are being delivered, let's say, directly to their home, and as a result, having companies like Amazon needing to hire 100,000 extra people, companies like CVS adding an extra 50,000 people. So what we're seeing is that in the area of things such as like pulp and paper, the amount of the type of product that they are needing to produce. We all know what it's like to go to the supermarket and look at items such as bath tissue, and so how do you handle that initial surge, knowing that surge will last for a period of time, and then people will have an awful lot of inventory, so they'll have to kind of change what they're producing. But it's also going to change the type of packaging and container board and the other products that they need to manufacture right now to support the companies that are doing a lot of that in-home delivery. It's also putting a lot of change to the food and beverage manufacturers and the pharmaceutical manufacturers, because rather than sending their goods and services to major retailers' warehouses that are now broken down into smaller lots and now shipped directly to put on the store shelves, some of that inventory is also being shipped directly to the consumer and kind of bypassing the traditional channels. So it's putting more pressure on them to change the way that their products are being packaged, for example. We're seeing in industries like automotive where they're initially when the impact was much strongest on China first, and saw that aspect of the supply chain get shut down, and then as the virus really moved into Europe, and seeing how the changes that they need to make there, and then a lot of those factories being shut down, and then obviously as that moved into North America. But it really put a lot of weight on the automotive industry because they didn't feel their supply chain was quite as nimble and flexible enough and adaptable, based on what was going on. Nobody can certainly dispute what's happening in the oil and gas industry, where you have tankers all throughout the ocean filled with unsold oil, and between the war, the pricing wars and the production wars between countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia, and in spite of the United States trying to see if they can intervene in that war, but looking at West Texas Intermediate and Brent down in the below $20 or slightly above $20. So we recognize what that kind of pressure that's putting on the oil and gas industry. So it's really been extremely volatile. But at the same time, we have found some common denominators, which is that what these companies across all industries need to do is find ways to make their supply chain more flexible and have greater visibility. At the same time, bringing like real-time principles into supply chain planning and execution. And the other thing is that no different than as we spend a lot of our days doing virtual meetings and webcasts and working from home, they'd like to bring a lot of those remote principles, bring it back to the factory floor and being able to leverage IoT technology and be able to get that information from the factory floor and deliver it to people's homes or wherever they may be, to be able to do a better job of running their facilities if the workforce cannot have access to the facility and people need to be making some of those production decisions, from remote locations. So those two phenomenons are really, really getting center of attention right now across all the industrial automation industries.
One of our other analysts just wrote a blog post about coronavirus in the control room, for example. So this highlights the need to do remote work. So I've heard, anecdotally, I've heard some stories about operators at power distribution centers essentially being in lockdown in the control room with a cot, running the plant to make sure they don't get sick. A lot of these facilities are running pretty lean. If a few people get sick, it can really mess up your schedule pretty bad, and you don't have enough qualified people to cover operations. So we see a big drive towards more remote operations and remote monitoring, and people need to be able to do that securely too. So in some ways, it's speeding up people's digitization programs because they need to do a lot of this stuff right now.
The shifts are just kind of amazing in that you'd have increases in things like consumer goods and food and beverage and things like that, but then there's the shift from utilities. A lot of industries would be depressed, but then things like water, wastewater, and power distribution would be shifting from commercial buildings to there'd be much more emphasis now on the residences because everybody's at home, right?
To a degree, that's correct. What's very interesting, though, is one of the challenges that these utilities, like everybody else, are having is whether or not they're kind of shifting the resources from, say, commercial to residential, but you still need to be able to make those changes. And this is where, again, as I talked about earlier and as Larry talked about earlier, this whole remote access issue, becomes front and center. And it's interesting because some of the industrial automation players have announced that they are making free licenses for remote access to their products and solutions free. So over the next quarter, they're going to be going to their customers that have their installed base and announcing that they're going to say, if you'd like to have remote HMI, for example, we're going to enable you to have free access. There was a recent case study of a water utility in Haverhill, Massachusetts, that has now been, has gone through exactly, Jim, what you just mentioned. And again, their automation suppliers are providing free access to the installed base of their equipment for that exact purpose. And as shifting some of the demand from commercial to residential and being able to monitor it from a remote location because that city has a stay-at-home order.
Right. It's just very tough to, wrap your head around some of those changes, and probably even tougher for the people who are actually, attempting to do it. Is any of the players in the process industries, mobilizing to help, local governments and healthcare providers handle the pandemic? And, if so, how are they doing it?
Well, I think what they're doing is, I think that just that first reaction of being able to provide the remote access and give those licenses away without even asking for purchase orders, because they recognize at this time where a lot of budgets are frozen, that people may have a difficult time accessing that. But we're seeing that from the automation suppliers across the board, kind of going to the aid of their customers, but at least something in the area of remote access is something that can be done, pretty instantaneously in a great deal of the installed bases.
Right. Well, you guys mentioned people are using much more of the Zoom tools and the Microsoft Teams and the teleconferencing if they have the bandwidth. Is there any other good strategies or practices that are helping the end users deal with COVID-19 that might be useful to others? Might they include?
Well, one of the things that we're seeing is people are really using this time that they're not traveling, that they're not going into the plants, that they're working from their home offices to really get into, I would say, really planning mode. And
Yeah,
now
I was
what
going
they
to say
do,
that too.
yeah. And one of the things, and it's actually at ARC, Larry and I and all our colleagues, the reason that we've been so busy over the last 3 or 4 weeks is that the end user community across all industries are saying, we've been talking about digital transformation for a long time. We've done some, we began our journey, but now we recognize that digital transformation is now mandatory. Instead of worrying about the initial, what's going to be the ROI, for example, of some of this digital transformation change, now we recognize that long term, when we come out of this, we had better be prepared to be able to have the most, flexible, nimble, real-time visible supply chain that's possible. And we better make sure that there's no geographic limitation to our ability to monitor and analyze and control our business. And when it comes to technologies, for example, such as using tools like augmented reality and virtual reality to kind of help supplement what people are seeing on the factory floor, because they may be walking the factory floor from a remote location, for example, and be able to really get to know what's happening there so they can make the best and most optimized decisions as possible. So you're seeing that right now is people are going to be, even if their budgets may be frozen for the moment, but this is going to be the second quarter, calendar quarter, 2020 is going to be the planning quarter. And people are going to say
not everybody's budgets are frozen right now either. I mean, we still have clients that are moving ahead with, planning projects to migrate, obsolete control systems and stuff like that. A lot of this stuff is still continuing. It's actually a good time to do this kind of project planning because, you're stuck behind a desk. So, what else you can do, right? You're not going to be able to do a lot of on-site stuff. So this type of longer-term planning, it's a pretty good time to be doing this kind of stuff if you can do it.
Right, Larry. You mentioned that some of the conditions when we talked earlier were similar to, the 2008, recession, and that.
Yeah, that's what we told people back in 2008 too. Is that this recession is going to end, and when it ends, you got to be ready to start up again. And I think this will be shorter term. I mean, they're saying we're going to have the peak of this virus within about 3 weeks, and then you figure there's a kind of a long tail on the end of that. But people are going to be out driving around again. Transportation will resume. All this stuff is going to come back on, so we got to be ready for it.
Right. Well, downstream, as when the gas prices are down and they're, Chicago area is like $2 or less, and so are the downstream industries and people that use energy going to, eventually that maybe they'll benefit. The essential industries are still open, but the lower oil and gas prices could benefit a lot of those industries as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we've heard, certainly, companies, for example, like in the petrochemical industry, just the inexpensive feedstock, for example, that they'd be having, how can they benefit from obviously the currently low oil prices? The other thing we've heard is if you are going to be borrowing money to finance some of these expansions, if you're getting pretty close to zero interest rates, this is really the time if the company is going to be, borrowing money, and obviously if they have a pretty solid line of credit, as many of our well-established manufacturing clients do, they would be in a position that they can really kind of leverage that low-cost capital to make some of these investments and expansion. But the thing that's really good with a lot of these digital transformation projects is and this is a question we get from a lot of our clients on the user side, is they'll say, do we really have to go through a full-blown rip and replace of our existing installed base of automation equipment to go ahead with these digital transformation projects? And the thing is that in many cases, these are additive. For example, it's like if you're adding, edge devices, edge control, within the plant to certainly allow you to run analytics locally and be able to make, better control decisions in real time without having to send that information outside the plant or up into the cloud. But using the decisions and now storing that information in the cloud long term. These are things that are additive to your existing install base. It's not going to require, massive investments of tearing everything out and, putting everything in state of the art. So the idea of digital transformation and what these companies are discovering is it's not going to be quite as daunting a task and require some of the massive investments that I think that sometimes there's a perception that it takes to get going.
Right. Well, I mean, I know a lot of folks are, somewhat deer in the headlights because the news is so unprecedented. The saying is people always, in a crisis situation, they just go with what they know. And so, I'm sure a lot of people will be a lot more, if it's not broke, don't fix it, don't make any, unusual moves. But then, like you said, this is an opportunity time when, borrowing is inexpensive. There's downtime to contemplate some of these. So I guess my question is, how do you get out of that deer in the headlights, that paralysis, and then what's the to-do list for a digital transformation project?
Well, I would say that to get rid of the deer or the headlights is to recognize that status quo will result in that the next time this happens, the next time there is a pandemic or some massive global crisis, the companies that do nothing today will be the companies that will not exist for the next cycle. You can try to short term just say I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to freeze all spending. I'm going to leave everything alone and just wait for everything to come back. But some of the things that we've heard, even from talking to some of our end-user clients, is that in the future, when they are trying to reestablish their supply chain, for example, they're not going to work with companies and partner with companies that don't have a similar level of digital transformation. They want to be able to communicate with these companies in real time, make absolute, quick decisions based on consumer demand, supply chain availability, energy costs, even a thing which we hadn't thought about several years ago, but even things like trade and tariff prices, for example. They need to have that information, essentially at their beck and call, so they're in a position that they can make fast changes based on the real-time conditions. And in many cases, they're not going to work with companies that don't have that ability themselves. So, for example, what that says is that end users are going to put the weight on their supply chain. They're going to put the weight on their automation suppliers to make sure that everybody's at a minimum level of digital transformation and have truly digitalized their systems, kind of moving from digitized to digitalized, and get to the point where all these systems are working in unison to make sure that the next time that we get hit blindsided by a crisis, that these companies have the ability to quickly redeploy manufacturing, quickly redeploy where their workers are able to make decisions, redeploy the equipment where they from on-site to remote or off-site. This is the stuff. This is so any indecision you have today, deer in the headlights, you may win the battle, but you're going to lose the war long term for the companies that are not planning now and certainly investing when things come back to be prepared for the next time.
Yeah, and like I said, this isn't a bad time to start thinking about project planning. And if you've been considering some kind of a IoT implementation, like Craig said, most of these solutions fit quite well over a variety of legacy equipment. Doesn't really matter what you have installed. They don't take that long to implement, versus, say, implementing a distributed control system, which is a highly engineered project that can last, for years, in a big installation. These IoT projects are much shorter times. You can realize a return on investment a lot faster. So it's not a time to put the brakes on as far as implementing these types of solutions. And in fact, like we said before, a lot of people are ramping up and accelerating their programs just so they can adapt to what's happening right now.
Right. But then, Larry, what would you say are just a couple of things that should be on my to-do list or my laundry list? Just get a couple of internet-enabled edge devices, do a little project, plug them in.
Well, first you need to know what you want to do, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you should have some kind of an objective in mind. And then you purchase the technology based on what your business objectives are, right? Because, you're buying the technology to achieve some kind of a business result, whether it's, you want to be more agile, to respond more quickly, or, maybe you're a city. One of the areas I look at now is smart cities. It's been kind of tough, articulating this value proposition of tying together all these different functional areas, which is what an IoT platform does, right? It's what a smart city platform does. It ties together information from water and utilities and, emergency health and safety stuff and everything else. So you get a single, that single pane of glass view into everything that's going on all at once, so you can make some informed decisions about what to do next. Now I think that value proposition is maybe a little easier to articulate, because you can actually see there's a lot of stuff going on right now, and we need to be able to react pretty quickly. And what's happening over here might have a big impact in what's happening in another area. So you need to understand those interrelationships a lot better.
Yeah, but I guess the advice to a typical end user, maybe somebody running a mid-sized process application, like water, wastewater, or a medium or small refinery of some kind, or processing downstream chemicals or food and beverage. Some of the stories we've done in the past were about kind of the end run, where you used to have to take the signals in, go through the I/O and the PLCs and the DCS, and so then in one of the unifying threads seemed to be that people could just get an internet-enabled sensor or module or something, and then just plug it into an internet network, and poof, there would be some, signals and parameters showing up on their laptop or their smartphone. And you'd still, any major control changes would be done by the traditional infrastructure, but there was just kind of like, just do a little end run around the usual, structure and get some of this data via the internet on whatever laptop or smartphone. And then you could begin to optimize, mostly used for monitoring, and then you could begin to optimize in a small way. And is that something people can do right now?
I think we're seeing a bigger push towards even more stuff, not just remote monitoring of a few sensors, but actual remote operations and eventually remote control.
Yeah.
A lot of it comes down to operational requirements again, and security is one of those. So it's great to, plug a smart sensor in with an internet connection and monitor it from your laptop or something. But, doing that at home with Raspberry Pi is a lot different from doing it in an industrial setting, especially when you're a critical infrastructure industry like water, wastewater, or power transmission and distribution. You really have to keep cybersecurity in mind. And secure, secure remote access.
Well, I must scold you guys because you're answering questions before I ask them, but I guess we've just done too many podcasts together. But that's true. If people are more remote and are at home more, how do you make your digital transformation project? If you're contemplating one, how do you make it secure? Is there a to-do list for that, Larry?
Yeah, and there are ways to do that, and those things need to be in your supplier selection criteria, So let's say I'm a water industry end user and I want to implement a new SCADA system, and my old one is 30 years old, and, I really want some remote access to go along with this. Well, number one, you're probably going to have to prioritize your migration project to maybe start at the HMI level and include secure remote access for the HMI. So how does your supplier do that secure remote access? Do they do it themselves? Do they have a partner? What is the methodology that they use, and so forth? So these are all things that you need to evaluate on a supplier by supplier basis. It's not. I wish we could answer that question in a podcast, but then we'd have to sit down for like an hour just to go over cybersecurity related selection criteria, for HMI and SCADA and DCS. But that is something that you need to keep in mind. And one of the things that we see a lot is that the users don't even have this kind of criteria when they're looking at new systems. So.
Yeah, well, we've got our assignment, our homework for next time, but I think it's just talking about some of these things, realizing that, all right, we do have a new challenge there. There's profound, unprecedented changes happening, but a lot of, there's ways to respond using much easier to use tools than we used to have, and there is remedies and ways to get out of that the paralysis, even though we're going through some difficult situations here. I guess, is that fair to say? Or?
Yeah, I think it's fair. There's a lot we can do right now to make things easier, to make it easier for people to work remotely in a secure fashion. To plan ahead for when things are going to start up again. And it's a good time to accelerate a digital transformation plan if you've been considering it, or you're sort of in the early stages or whatever. Don't stop.
Hey, Craig, I was going to ask, I was trying to remember what we just talked about, and of course, sometimes I can't, but could we put in a nutshell kind of, which industries are up and which are down?
Well, I mean, right now, from the consumer products perspective, people are certainly still, I think, from a food and beverage perspective, the pharmaceutical perspective, these industries still have to continue to produce and fill the supply chain. And as we were saying earlier, even if the method of acquiring the good is different, even if it shifted, say, from food distribution, let's say, to the restaurant distribution, to more of either direct to the consumer distribution. But the thing is that the food, beverage, and pharmaceutical supply chain, has to continue to produce. So those industries, I would say, will be the least affected right now. But at the same time, they is still, because of stay-at-home work orders, these industries recognize the fact that how do they maintain the consumer demand if they, in their particular geographies, don't necessarily have access to the plants. So right now, we see from food, beverage, and pharmaceutical, those industries are going to, again, remain healthy for the time being, but recognize that to meet their customer requirements, they are going to have to be implementing a lot of these digital transformation, supply chain and remote access technologies. From the oil and gas perspective, at some point, with the low price, and when people begin driving again, you will begin to see the prices begin to creep up once we start, get rid of a lot of this excess inventory. And again, if anything politically can be done and to negotiate between Russia and Saudi Arabia and OPEC members to see if they can cut back on production, and instead of flooding the world with supply, cutting back, which so you can combine that with greater consumer consumption, say in a quarter from now, plus less supply. So you'd start to bring that up. But one of the things that is going to happen in the oil and gas industry is, because of the fact that the break-even line will, even for, traditional production, I'm not even talking shale, and certainly we're many, many dollars away from talking of things like oil sands. But you're going to be at a point where these companies recognize that they're going to have fewer workers in the field. They're going to have to be able to do more monitoring and control of production facilities, with digital transformation. So we're really going to see that get accelerated because, the new normal in oil and gas is they're just going to have to find ways to again, be profitable, at a lower price per barrel. And digital transformation will be the way that helps them achieve that. And Larry and I can certainly tell you that our oil and gas clients have been very thirsty for information at ARC, because that's exactly what they're thinking right now, without getting into any specific company names. But this is certainly something that they're all very aggressive about. From the automotive industry, just saw the first beginning to start to see the March sales numbers. First company I saw was Hyundai announced a 43% decline in sales in March compared to the March the year before. So you're probably figuring that that's probably going to be reflective amongst all the suppliers from March. So the first quarter numbers will be certainly dented, but the second quarter numbers will probably be more reflective of the March numbers. That is going to create a little bit of a pent-up demand once things start to hopefully normalize in the third and fourth quarter, because cars that have not been replaced and then people begin driving again and need to replace those vehicles. The other thing that happens, especially in the United States, is that when you do have low oil prices and low gasoline prices, people begin to then shift back to the cars that they typically like to buy, which are SUVs, crossovers, pickup trucks, cars that are a little bit more expensive to operate based on the gasoline prices. So with lower gasoline prices, you're going to certainly have sales are going to increase in the vehicles that the auto manufacturers, from a profit margin perspective, really like to sell. So, the Ford would far rather be selling F-150s and Explorers, and GM would far rather be selling a lot of Suburbans and Escalades and Silverados, because that's where they're going to make the most money. So we do see maybe towards the end of the year, a bit of a resurgence in the automotive industry, especially benefiting those the lower fuel prices. From a pulp and paper industry, once they get over the surge of bath tissue and some of the other issues that are flying off the shelf, I think that the new normal is going to be there's going to continue to be more growth in cardboard and packaging board. I mean, that's certainly been keeping those companies going very, very strongly, certainly with the whole ship at home and Amazon phenomenon, and that's only going to increase, because I do think there's going to be a certain amount of the consumer that's going to say, something, I kind of like having some of these products shipped to my home, even those that maybe were not Amazon Prime members, certainly before this crisis, that are now have become and may begin to shift. And that's going to certainly create a major shift for all the food and beverage and pharmaceutical companies as well, as more of those products get delivered directly to the home rather than just through the retail channels. So I think from the chemical industry perspective, we've certainly heard from some of our chemical clients that are, especially those that are making things that are now being enlisted to make products like hand sanitizer that hadn't in the past, but are also making a lot of cleaning solutions. And I think that this is going to create some new habits by people around the world, as far as with hand washing and sanitizing, and people that may not have done those things quite as a regular practice may begin to adopt that as regular practice. So we do think that on that end, that's going to have a positive impact on the chemical companies that make that, and they again will also benefit from the lower price feedstock of the, certainly with a lower price barrel, price per barrel of oil.
Well, I mean, that's an amazing summary there, and thanks. So I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but Larry, I also want to put you on the spot. Is there any items that Craig might have missed, or final thoughts?
My perspective is more from security, from cybersecurity and remote operations, and trying to deal with the situations that are happening in control rooms right now, and how plants are operating, and even for process plants that might be drawing down operations a little bit right now. Basically keeping staff safe and healthy to be able to keep the plants running in a safe manner is of the utmost importance. So, there's also some organizational aspects to this too, in terms of how you want to handle staffing. If you want to have people on site, on a semi-permanent basis, like that example I gave earlier in power distribution, where they literally, kind of have a cot in the control room kind of situation. But, these are organizational issues that have to be addressed during this crisis too. And also physical security, right? Controlling access in and out of plants, maybe limiting, some of the ways that you've had to get in and out of plants before, and maybe just narrow it down to one entry and exit, or what have you. These are all things that you need to consider if you're, in a large plant environment, and there's this epidemic going around, and you obviously you don't want more people to get sick.
Okay. All right. Oh, and I was trying to think while you guys were talking, you mentioned the free licensing, and I think we did have a couple of news items in our April issue and probably online as well.
Yeah, there's some cybersecurity suppliers too that are offering free licenses to some of their secure remote operations stuff out there. So it's a good time actually to start experimenting with some of this. If you want to try some stuff out, it's a good time to get, and this is like free for 6 months kind of stuff. Or I think you said 9 months, Craig, but it's not just 30 days free. It's much longer term than that. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know. I don't know. You guys can mention names, but I don't think I'm prevented. So I think it was ABB and GE Digital were the two that we covered, but I know there's other ones as well. And just another side note on our just going to the printer coverage. I wanted to highlight something in news, but ARC's website and its subpage, impact of COVID-19 on industrial markets, detailed your efforts and your colleagues to respond to the pandemic, and there's like more than 20 online reports about it. Just all the topics we talked about. So you can find that right on the ARC, the arcweb.com website. I think the full address was arcweb.com/impact-covid19-industrial-markets. So that's just a shout out to the website there, and because we don't want the podcast to take over too much. And anyway, listen, Larry and Craig, thanks for helping me and our listeners begin to get a handle on how COVID-19 may shake out in the process automation control fields. Getting a sense of what's going on in uncertain situations can be really helpful. And I just thank you guys again for really accomplishing that today.
Well, thank you, Jim, and for everyone. And be well and stay safe, everyone.
All right, and we wish that of everybody we come in contact with, virtually or in person. This has been another Control Amplified podcast. I'm Jim Montague. Thanks for listening, and as always, remember that Control Amplified podcasts are available on most podcasting apps, such as the iTunes Store and Google Play, and on Control Magazine's YouTube channel podcasts. Plus, you can just go to controlglobal.com and listen to them there as well. All right. Thanks a bunch, everybody.